Welcome to Newshour. Now, France is a country not exactly unfamiliar with strikes and protests, but this time it's been paralysed by one of the most disruptive days in recent memory. Angry strikers swept the country yesterday as unions staged a nationwide walkout against the government's so-called austerity agenda. Now, the trigger was the 2026 draft budget, first presented under François Bayrou's leadership. It called for sweeping cuts to public spending in line with EU fiscal demands. Though Bayrou has since been replaced by Sébastien Lecornu, his successor has not ruled out continuing with those original plans. Now, for the unions, that was reason enough to take to the streets. Teachers, transport workers, healthcare staff and utility employees all joined together in the stoppage. In France, metro and train lines were suspended, schools closed and commuters facing widespread disruption. Nationwide, 250 separate demonstrations were staged. But it wasn't only the unions. The Block Everything movement, a citizen collective born online, they staged blockades, triggered metro alarms and organised flash protests. Loosely coordinated and fuelled by social media, it brought an unpredictable edge to the unrest, signalling a shift in how protest takes shape in France. Let's cross to Paris now, where our correspondent Ross Cullen has more on how this is impacting the nation.
Well, Guy, I'm here in Paris outside a closed pharmacy, just one of thousands of drugstores which are shuttered across France on Thursday as part of this day of industrial action. There's actually a note in red on the other side of the wall. You might be able to just make it out, which says we're closed today so that we don't have to close forever. Pharmacy is just one of the industries which are taking industrial action on Thursday. We are seeing firefighters and emergency service personnel walk out, doctors, nurses, airport staff, railway workers, train drivers and conductors as well taking action this Thursday. Another sector which is impacted, the education sector. You can see on the front page of Le Parisien on Thursday. The great ingenuity of parents is the headline, because parents are having to be at home today trying to work out with kids that they expected to be at school. 45% of teachers nationwide are walking out this 18th of September. And the front page of Libération I can show you as well. This is Sophie Binet. She's the head of the CGT, France's largest union, saying that the bosses are starting to lose the battle of ideas. That is one of the key reasons why people are protesting on Thursday, because they would like to see a new tax on the super rich, something that's been proposed by the economist Gabriel Zucman in recent weeks, saying that by targeting just the 2,000 richest households in France, you could bring in an extra $20 billion worth of taxes every year. People are demonstrating against the ongoing political instability. The previous Prime Minister, François Bayrou, was ousted just 1 week ago. They're demonstrating against the President's ongoing problems in the labour markets, also against the pension reforms of 2023, still so controversial. They are demonstrating due to the cost of living crisis. So there are so many reasons why so many people are protesting in France on Thursday. Hundreds of thousands of demonstrators in towns and cities up and down the land. Of course, it comes just 8 days after the Block Everything movement, which tried to bring the country to a halt on the 10th of September. And so you can see that in the space of just 8 days, two major protests, increasing the pressure on the new Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu.
Ross, thank you very much indeed. Well, as we've been hearing then, the Block Everything movement is adding to a new dynamic to France's protest culture. To explore what this means politically, we turn now to the director of the Foundation's Opinion Observatory, Antoine Bristel, who gave this interview just before last Wednesday's protests.
The Block Everything protest movement, which called for a day of actions around France on Wednesday, September 10th, showed a crisis in representative democracy in the country and defiance among the population towards political leaders.
It's a movement that expresses a strong distrust of political institutions, but also of the political personnel in power since 2017. This is crystallized in the figure of Emmanuel Macron, and that's why these people are still calling for mobilization on September 10th, despite the fact that they initially mobilized against ousted French Prime Minister François Bayrou's budget, and that François Bayrou was removed from office following the vote of no confidence on September 8th. What we see is that there is a real crisis of representative democracy in France, which is expressed by the fact that there is a real difficulty at the moment in being able to find a government that can last for a long time. We saw it in the space of a few months. We had Michel Barnier, we have François Bayrou, and we will have a new prime minister again very soon. And alongside that, there is real social anger, real distrust of these institutions, which is struggling to find a way of expression in political parties and in elections. And so people, given that elections seem blocked, are looking for other ways to make their demands come true. And that is why they are also trying to mobilize outside of political parties. It's a movement that is more horizontal than what we saw, for example, during the pension reform, where it was really the unions who were at the forefront, who led the demonstrations. Here, it's really a movement that seeks to be horizontal, distant from the unions, distant from the political parties, in order to try to bring together as broadly as possible within the French population. What we notice are people who are very aligned with left-wing values on these economic issues. That is to say, they demand much more redistribution of wealth, much more social justice. And also there is a slightly populist anti-wealthy sentiment. That is to say, a real distrust of the political, but also economic elites that is expressed very clearly. In the Yellow Vest movement, we had a rather precarious France that was struggling to make ends meet, a lot of workers, a lot of retirees. Whereas here, in terms of age, it's mostly young people. We even have an overrepresentation of executives. We also have an overrepresentation of people with a very high level of education, bachelor's or master's degrees. And then also, it's not necessarily a precarious France, it's rather a middle class. A small middle class that is mobilizing not only for itself, but for a certain vision of the world where there would be more social justice, less inequality, and a political system that would function differently and better. We need to see what Emmanuel Macron's reaction will be to this. Which prime minister will he choose to appoint? Will he dissolve the National Assembly? That seems unlikely. Or will he appoint a prime minister who is more left-wing, more centrist, or more right-wing? Depending on his response, it could either lead to greater anger among the population, and therefore potentially a social movement that could strengthen. We see that there is another social movement planned for September 18th called for by unions. Or on the contrary, it could calm the anger and provide a kind of breathing space.
Okay, very interesting take there on the new dynamics reshaping French protests. But what does all this mean for France's politics more broadly, for the government in Paris, for its relationship with Brussels, and for the balance of power between the unions and the street? Well, to explore that, I'm joined now by Antonio Leite, Chair Professor at Nova SBE in Lisbon, Portugal. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Why is the French government pushing ahead with austerity now, do you think? And we use this word austerity, don't we? It's become a very popular term. How austere actually are these proposals? You know, is it really too much to ask people for France not to become the country that's spending more publicly than almost any other?
Thank you for the question. Is becoming a very peculiar nation because they talk of all this without taking into consideration that expenditures need to be financed, spending has to be financed, and that a country cannot go on doing more than what the country actually can pay for. In retrospect, if we look at the last 3 years, for example, we see that the economic performance has been in line with, I would say, the average of the Eurozone. But contrary to many other countries, what we have been seeing is a very important rise in the debt in France, just because they cannot generate revenues in line with the increasing expenditures that the government has. And the dynamic of that expenditure or those expenditures moving forward is such that they will have to raise taxes more and more, raise more revenues all the time. They came to a situation that is unstable. And regardless of what the French think, part of their, I would say, spending splurge is being financed by people that are not French, which are professional investors that are using other people's savings and buying French treasury. And they came to a point that they are really worried that if they cannot have the same sort of liquidity and trustworthiness as they have had in the past. And that's why you see, for example, that over the last few days, the spread on French treasury is increasing. The rating of the French Republic has been declining. And for the first time in many years, for example, we have that the spread on the French debt is greater than the spread on the Italian debt, that is historically a country with a very high debt to GDP ratio. That means that the French are starting to have trouble to finance what they think is fair.
Well, no wonder, Antonio. Frank, sorry to butt in. No wonder. I mean, I've got a list here in front of me of with lots and lots of other countries on there. I mean, there might be a country that's spending more publicly than France, but if there is, it's not on my list and I can't find it. I mean, what is the what is the concept here? What is the philosophy? Is it that in order to be fiscally responsible at all, that is to be described as being so severe to be austere? I mean, it's sort of like a teenage philosophy, doesn't it? It makes no sense at all, does it?
Yeah, no, because what we're talking about is not really austerity, even though all the French talk about austerity. It has to do with the fact that the French act as if the French economy in Europe was growing and the demographics would be the same we had in the 1960s and the 1970s. And they didn't want to change anything in their social state, contrary to what people did in the Netherlands, to what people did in the UK, in Germany, in the Nordics, in Portugal, Spain, Italy, and many other countries. So the French are very resistant to change because they think that every single right that they have is non-negotiable. And the point is, it may be non-negotiable politically, but the fact is non-bankable. What really does not come to the picture. The French will not be able to do the improvements in their accounts that they need to show the world, because they're not the only ones financing all this. A lot of this is being financed with foreign money, and even though the French will have some reserves that will probably mean that we're not on the verge of some collapse, the point is the current situation is not sustainable.
Yeah, and sorry, but again, you talk about foreign money. It's a very good point you make, Antonio. What about involvement from Brussels? How much of this agenda, this philosophy, if you like, is being shaped by pressure from Brussels, do you think?
At this point, it's mostly the markets that are pressuring. Of course, Brussels will have the same opinion as the markets. The point is, it's much easier to tell Ireland or Portugal that in order for you to stay and behave, you need to change what you're doing. When it comes to France, it's more difficult, just because it's Europe's second largest economy, and the political clout of France is different from the political clout of other countries that had similar problems in the past. So I'm sure Brussels and the ECB are totally aligned with the need for France to cut their expenditure. Also because even if you take Zuckman's proposal, which, have been tried over and over and over, he can get some money, certainly not as much as he thinks, because rich people are always the first ones to move their wealth much more easily than the middle class, the upper middle class, or the low class. And the experience that it reached that go on taxing more and more and more the very wealthy. Of course, there's a fairness question here, and I'm not saying Zuckman is wrong. What I'm saying is, even if he's right, it's not enough given the dynamic of the increase in France's expenditure. So we'll have to find other sources of revenues in a few years. On the other hand, a lot of the rich people, as you know from Britain, will take the money out of the French jurisdiction before the taxes get into effect. So this is a very tricky situation, and I see no other solution than really taming the very dangerous dynamic that they have in their government spending.
Okay, let's look at someone who might be able to try at least and tame that dynamic, as you put it. Minister Lecornu, let's talk about him as an individual. I mean, he's the Prime Minister at the moment, after a long run of unsuccessful ones. Has he got genuine political space, clout, do you think, to really change this budget plan?
I think it's very difficult. Yes, I wouldn't say it's an unsurmountable task, because then he should quit right away. But I think he has a very difficult task. First, because his mentor, or the person above him, the President of France, has lost a lot of credit, especially within France. On the other hand, we have an increase in popularity of the extreme right, which is also not like a liberal right. They're not like the UK conservatives or the French conservatives of the past, les Républicains. They are basically people that are on the right on social issues and on issues of country and even race, whatever. But economically, they are pro-government. So they want the government to be present as much as possible, and so they do not defend any cuts.
Not libertarian in their outlook, then. In fact, quite the opposite.
So just to finish, on the other hand, the left. So what happens is the main political parties and the French people do not want to face what they need to do. And so they think, well, if we bust all this up, then maybe things will get together. But that doesn't happen that way. When you have a problem, you have to tackle the sources of the problem. And the problem, and the question in France now is political. Very few people, Lecornu is one of those, talks with rationality. Most people don't want to hear anything rational. They're just mad. They're just frustrated. They're just coming to grips with the fact that what they think is the exceptionalism of France, in the end, does not exist. The economic rules apply to France the same way they apply to any other country.
Well, let's just talk a bit about that irrational busting up, as you put it. I mean, how bad could it get? How bad will it get, do you think, if the government is perceived to keep ignoring union anger?
There must be a dialogue, because at this point the rage is so high and the protests are going so out of hand that brute force will not solve the problem. So they have to find ways at some point to sit down and talk. Because even for the opposition, which is dominant at this point, both on the extreme right and on the extreme left, which have grown to a very sizable importance in France, they don't want to inherit a country that doesn't. So dialogue has to be present. And the problem is that a lot of times the source of such dialogue, which is like a respected president, unfortunately, it's not happening at this point. The president of France is actually the target of a lot of this rage, of a lot of this frustration. But they have to find a way, because if they don't, then we start having problems that go beyond France. Because, like I said, France is a key country in the Eurozone. And for example, Germany is not in the best of shape. Of course, they don't have any of these problems, but they're not growing economically. And so, it's very important for the euro. Brussels needs to help more than complain or than just say the French that they cannot keep going on. I think we have to help the French to talk with one with the others, so that some rationality emerges and the country is able to move forward. Because what people on the street want, they may be right that everything it was promised did not happen, but the fact is what they want is not reachable. Nobody in France is going to be able, whatever the politics they choose, to make things happen the way enraged populace at this point wants to happen. So it's a very, very difficult situation politically. Economically, is much easier to see what they have to do, but it's worthless if they don't have the political means and if they don't have the political will and a certain consensus to move forward in the right direction. More of this is very dangerous for France and starts being dangerous for its neighbors.
Yeah, and Antonio, it's hard to see where that consensus might be coming from. I mean, it clearly looks like this is about so much more than just the 2026 budget. It's tapping into deeper frustrations, even a sense of which the country isn't sure who it is or even who it wants to be.
Yeah, well, France has changed quite a lot. There are problems which are common to most people. Then there are peculiar problems of certain parts of the population, which were not really assimilated in the French way of life, as President Macron said over and over and over. Things did not work. And a lot of them now are being used by some of the people on the political left, especially, but also as a reaction on the political right, to be an additional source of confusion. And on top of that, France is paying for having politicians that were never able for quite some time to explain people that France is not a country that is different from the others. And even magnificent France will have to do what the others do when the problems arise, and that the world in which they were born and raised is no longer here. Europe is no longer, a number two or number one political and economic powerhouse. Europe used to be as rich as the US. Now we are about 50% poorer than the US. Things have not worked, and therefore expectations have to adjust to the ability that we, Europe, and then France in particular, can provide for the entirety of the French. Of course, they may have problems of vision of the fiscal that probably needs some change, but overall, what is demanded by the people, it's not reachable. And what they want, it's not doable by any government. And the problem is that some people still say, without explaining how, they still say that they can reach that. And so the problem again is people are being used up by some politicians and a very large part of the political class, and they talk as if they were not in a rational world, which is amazing because Descartes was French. The century of light was French. French used to be rational, but for some reason over the last 20 years, they have been losing collective rationality, and they're not accepting something that is inevitable.
Well, let me ask you what hopefully will be a reasonably rational question. There's a school of thinking which says that the very last thing that the gym wants is for the individual to get fit and stay fit. The very last thing that the rehab centre wants is for the individual to get clean and stay clean. By the same logic, are the unions now much stronger? Are they flourishing because of this public discontent?
I think they are. As we saw on the pieces that were shown before, it goes beyond the unions, it goes beyond the political parties, but of course the political parties are part of the discontent, and some of them are actually trying to make it more evident and louder, as if it can be even louder than what it has already been. And unions are certainly gaining strength. And not just the politicians, also the elites of France have failed to explain to it that exceptionalism, and that, you know, France has had this problem for quite some time. France has now a debt to GDP ratio of above 115% and is growing with this huge deficit year after year, while most of the other countries in Europe, of course, changing the rights of their own population, have been adjusting to a more stable path. And you don't see this. Britain has undergone tremendous reforms that hurt a very large amount of its population, but the reaction was not this road rage, this street rage, as we see in France. And the solution for that has to be political. So that's why I'm worried, because I don't see the signals that they are working on consensus, that they're working on dialogue, that they're working on mutual concessions from ones to the others, so that they can reach some sort of agreement and then go on to a more rational path towards the future. So this is a real problem at this point. And like I said, France is no different from all the other countries, the US included. When means don't, you know, when the ends don't meet, you have to do something about it, and you have to in this case, since the economy will not grow as it did in the 60s, you have to adjust, because we also have a much more unfavorable demography, what you can provide people to the means that you can obtain.
Yeah.
And that's the exercise that the French need to understand. It has to be done.
Antonio, we thank you very much indeed for your analysis. Always good to see you. Thanks again. Okay, road rage, street rage. France's streets have once again shaped the national debate, with unions applying organised pressure and block everything amplifying disruption. The Lecornu government faces a dual challenge, one negotiating, the other demanding to be heard. The months ahead will test its resolve. Well, that is all from A News. Thanks for being with us. Good night.